Well, thank you very much, Senator Cruz, for joining us today to talk about connectivity and the urban-rural broadband divide. The 2018 broadband report found that about 14 million Americans do not have access to high-speed broadband, including 31% of rural households and 35% of tribal households. And looking at this issue, policymakers have been considering what to do for some time. The private sector has pledged to spend tens of billions of dollars over the next few years to help do that. And how important is it to the state of Texas to provide people with access to high-speed broadband, particularly in hard-to-serve rural areas?
Well, I think broadband is critically important for enabling people to access the world. You know, you look at what the internet has meant. The internet has been an extraordinary oasis of freedom. The internet grew up largely free from government regulation. Grew up, contrary to popular belief, not invented by Al Gore, but in a wonderful scenario where people could innovate online and they didn't need anyone's permission, could speak online, and particularly early on, there was no one, everyone became their own broadcaster. Everyone became their own newsman or newswoman. You know, you think of seminal moments in the internet. I think one of them was, remember, the fall of Dan Rather. And Dan Rather, who was once one of the titans of journalism, was taken down by, what was the phrase, bloggers in their pajamas? I mean, what an incredible statement that an individual citizen could go and fact check, say, wait a second, what I'm being told is not right, and could put it out to the world and transform the debate. You look at the business side. The barriers to entry of creating a new business. The internet has caused them to plummet. It used to be if you wanted to start a business, the capital cost could be quite considerable. You needed a physical facility, you needed a plant, you needed a warehouse, you needed a marketing team, you needed distribution, you needed some way to get whatever your good or your service was to your customers. You now have the ability, if you have an idea, whether man or woman, whether boy or girl, you have teenagers and kids starting businesses, where you can put up a website and whatever it is you're selling, you're instantly able to connect with the whole country, if not the whole world. And between the internet and FedEx, you suddenly have the ability to get your goods to market without barriers in the way. All of those are tremendously important. And like any asset in our economy, the distribution is not immediate and instantaneous. We're seeing it focus initially where they're the highest concentration of people. But certainly in a state like Texas that has many rural communities, and across the country there are a lot of rural communities, we need to see greater penetration of broadband because it expands opportunities, it expands the ability of small businesses to be created, it expands the ability of someone out in the middle of West Texas with tumbleweeds blowing by to connect with a world-famous heart surgeon on the other side of the country. To connect with anyone in the world, and that opens up all sorts of new potential. So your question was, how important is it? Tremendously important, and that leads to what I suspect your next question is, which is how do we get there? That's the more complicated one.
Well, and in that, what's the role of government in getting there? Because we've had concerns about the stimulus spending. We're concerned about what might occur with the $200 billion infrastructure plan, where $50 billion is going for rural infrastructure. How do we make sure that money is spent appropriately? And then how do we make sure that it reaches the people it's supposed to reach?
Well, listen, Citizens Against Government Waste has been tremendous, highlighting the waste and abuse and fraud that comes from government programs and spending. You know, in the Obama stimulus program, as you know, there was $2.5 billion ostensibly for rural broadband, and a lot of that money ended up nowhere near rural broadband. We just passed another omnibus. I voted against the omnibus, but there was $600 million in there ostensibly for rural broadband. You know, part of the problem is when you have government allocating capital, what you know is it's going to be allocated wrong. And that's actually not you know, you see people in Washington sometimes who are sort of good government folks, and they say, well, gosh, if just we could get government to operate like a business. Sometimes Republicans think this way. If we just got smarter, more noble people, we'd spend it the right way. And one of the things to understand is that never, ever, ever is going to happen. You know, there are some folks in here who I suspect are familiar with the Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises. Incredible economist. I'm getting chuckles from the right because Jerry Ellig was my former deputy at the FTC and is now the chief economist at the FCC. And I know Jerry knows von Mises well. Not personally, but von Mises wrote a wonderful little book called On Bureaucracy, where he talked about the question, the perennial question, can we make government work more like a business? And von Mises concluded, no, we can't. And he explained that structurally what is lacking in government, and that will always be lacking, is the profit motive. Now, the profit motive is not just some side feature of the private sector. It is the animating principle that unifies the incentives of everyone in a private enterprise. So, if I'm working for you, Tom, in the private sector, you're CEO of a big company, and let's say I'm the janitor, I'm sweeping the floors, and I come in and I say, sir, I've got an idea that can increase the company's revenue by 10% and not increase our cost by anything. I suspect you may listen for the next 30 seconds to see what comes out of my mouth. And if I'm right, if I actually have an idea that makes sense, I'm pretty willing to bet I'm not going to be sweeping floors much longer. Likewise, if I come in and say, sir, I've got an idea, we can increase our expenditures by 10% and not generate any revenue, you'd probably throw me out the door, and I wouldn't even be sweeping floors then either. Every one of those incentives are unified throughout the company. That's the effect of the profit, but what Mises explained is in government, with that absent. Look, government leaders are responding to incentives, but the incentives they're responding to are political. So this conversation makes perfect sense in politics. You're working in a government agency and you say, sir, I've got an idea. We've got right now 100,000 people using our program. We can expand it and give away double our budget, spend twice as much money, and have twice as many people on the program. On government incentives, that makes perfect sense. When you deal with government doling out capital, as can be in the rural broadband area, you look at something like Solyndra. Solyndra wasn't an aberration. It's government responding to the natural incentives, because when you have government doling out capital, they're not looking for where you're going to earn a return. If you're spending your own money, you're looking at, all right, where's the greatest return on capital? If it's government funding, they're looking for where's the political payoff. Hey, this particular project happens to be in the district of the chairman of my appropriations committee. That's clearly the project that's important. Those incentives are exactly wrong. And so I think the way to encourage the development of broadband is not to have Washington, D.C. doling out the numbers and doling out the money where you can ensure that it'll be spent on almost everything except what ostensibly we're being told it's going to be spent. But rather, we should be removing regulatory barriers to make it easier for the private sector to deploy capital to meet those needs. And by the way, the one thing we know is it's not going to be met in the way we expect. That's one of the other reasons why government is so bad at this and the private sector is so much better. Whatever the problem is, it's going to be different than we expect because there are challenges and there's going to be innovation, and government doesn't do innovation. That's not in, we've got an RFP, we're doing it this way, it doesn't work, doesn't matter, doesn't need to work, we're doing it anyway. I remember the Senate Armed Services Committee having a hearing with the Secretary of the Navy where I talked to him about a wind farm that they had built, I believe in an area of Alaska where the wind didn't blow. Just a minor detail, but they built it anyway, and no one actually bothered to check if it was very windy there. It's the private sector that's able to be nimble and respond to changed circumstances and innovate And we need to be looking for how we maximize the incentives and maximize the ability to innovate.
So how do we encourage the agencies to do that? If you're talking about deregulation, the FCC and other agencies are doing some of that now. What else do you think they might be able to do?
Well, I'll tell you, that's one of the areas I'm most optimistic about the Trump administration. Beginning of last year, I laid out what I saw as the 4 big priorities for Republican majorities in both houses and a Republican administration. And those were tax reform, regulatory reform, Obamacare, and judges. And I think 15 months in, it is remarkable just how much of that has been accomplished. On reg reform, almost without exception, every single cabinet member I've sat down with, reg reform is among the first words out of their mouth. I think there is a real and genuine and meaningful commitment to reg reform. If you look at the FCC, I am a big fan of Chairman Pai. I think Ajit is doing a terrific job. I think the vilification of the left of Chairman Pai shows a really brutal, ugly side of our political discourse. You have left-wing activists targeting his wife and targeting his kids in a way that should be grossly unacceptable in the political or public sphere, or any other sphere for that matter. But I think despite all of that ugliness, I think Chairman Pai is doing a very good job and demonstrating courage. And I think across the board, one of the things my office is doing quite a bit is working with each of the agencies to push policies reducing job-killing regulations to make it easier for the private sector to deploy capital and create jobs, because that's what's going to drive the economy.
There's no question about that, because of course the technology landscape changes quickly. I know everyone recalls when they were suing Microsoft and then Google barely existed, Facebook didn't exist at all, and look what happened. There were companies that came in and innovated in the private sector. So to us, that's the big role of government, to get out of the way, reduce regulations, allow the private sector to flourish, because that's where competition and innovation occurs. So in the next generation, some of these things work in urban areas, some of them work in rural areas. 5G is good because it's close together, it's packed in urban areas, but there is still this broadband divide in the rural areas. You may have cable, you may have satellite, fixed or mobile wireless. So again, how can the government do more to make sure that technology moves forward?
Well, you would expect there to be differential technology deployed in different environments, depending on what the needs are, depending on what best meets those needs. I think one of the things you want to create is an environment that discourages monopolies, that encourages competition, that reduces the barriers to innovation. One of the fabulous things about the internet is it allows innovation. I remember back in, was it 2002, when Jerry and I were both at the FTC, we chaired hearings for 3 days, hearings on barriers to e-commerce. And we looked at a host of different industries. And the pattern was the same across the board in all of them, which was that there were bricks and mortar competitors who would go to their state and local regulators and say, we're getting competition from these pesky online competitors. So could you put in legal and regulatory barriers to keep them out? And each of the hearings just brought in testimony, and it was striking. We compiled a series of reports at the end of those hearings. But one of the more interesting, so it did all sorts of, whether it was contact lenses or automobiles or wine sales or funerals and caskets or telemedicine. I mean, all of them, every industry was interesting. There was at least one person on the panel who testified, look, I looked at these other 9 industries, and those barriers to competition are terrible. They're hurting consumers badly. But our industry is different. We actually compiled each of the 10 saying that. Those barriers get put into place. The beauty of the internet, you look at something like, let's take an Uber or a Lyft, or an Airbnb that suddenly is disintermediating the middleman. that produces enormous innovation. So I think we need to be looking to reduce barriers to innovation for deploying broadband. It's one of the reasons why I've been so outspoken against, there was a proposal floated within the administration a couple of months ago, nationalizing 5G. I think that is an absolutely terrible idea. I've been outspoken. Indeed, I joined with Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto in writing a letter together opposing this. There are not many issues you see Democrats and Republicans agreeing on, but the federal government nationalizing broadband, I was glad we could stand together and say, look, that's not the job of government. It's unfortunate that we haven't seen the administration categorically make clear they're not going down that path. I'm hopeful they won't, but I'd be happier hearing that a little more explicitly. You see municipalities that want to use government power to seize control of broadband, and if you want to kill innovation, if you want to eliminate competition, then that's a fabulous idea. But if you actually want to see robust competition playing out, then you want to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I would note also one of the important pieces in terms of expanding the availability of broadband generally and 5G as the technology moves forward is the availability of spectrum. And that clearly there's a government role, an important government role. Look, number one, spectrum, you've got to allocate it to someone. You can't have everyone using the same bandwidth or it doesn't work. So there's clearly a regulatory role of policing the property rights. So that's one of the most fundamental roles of government, is enforcing property rights, just the same as your house is your house, and I don't get to walk into your living room and say, now it's my living room. That the government exists to protect your property rights, and in spectrum it's much the same. The more spectrum that is available to the private sector, the more incentive there is going to be to innovate. The more incentive it is to use that spectrum in the most effective, the most efficient manner. And there are large portions of spectrum that remain in the federal government's hands, especially DoD and the defense world. It's one of the things that I've been trying to do. I am one of the few, if not very few, senators serve on Commerce, Armed Services, and Judiciary, and I'm on all three. That gives an ability, all of the stakeholders on the question of shifting bandwidth and spectrum to the private sector, all of the stakeholders are impacted by one or multiple of those committees. And so one of the roles that I've been trying to play is bringing the players together and really trying to think from a public choice perspective. How do you incentivize the players so that the DoD stakeholders will have an incentive to give up that spectrum because they're getting upside on the back end? But I think the more spectrum being available, particularly with lower regulatory barriers, the more innovation we're going to see spreading broadly.
All right, we have time for two more questions. One is in regard to the...
Are you trying to say senators are long-winded?
Not at all, sir. Not at all. No.
You would be the first person in history to make that observation.
Not at all. But one is about this idea that the Democrats are going to propose a Congressional Review Act effort in the Senate to overturn the FCC's very wise decision on the Restoring Internet Freedom Order in December. And so what do you think is going to happen?
I don't know. I'm worried about it. Net neutrality was a spectacularly bad idea. At the time, a phrase I used was that net neutrality was Obamacare for the Internet. Now, I will commend the proponents of net neutrality. There is an Orwellian beauty, number one, to the name. The name net neutrality sounds so nice and fuzzy and sweet. But what net neutrality is all about, which, by the way, when the FCC ended net neutrality, you saw activists on the left lighting their hair on fire and running around saying the world is ending, the world is ending. What was amazing is a lot of political discourse is not necessarily deeply informed, but the level of lack of information on that was stunning. So net neutrality, look, the internet grew up with no rules governing so-called net neutrality. In 2015, the Obama FCC, in what I believe was a blatantly illegal power grab, regulated the internet as a Title II public utility. Now that's under legislation adopted in the 1930s to regulate, big rotary phone companies. Technology that has virtually nothing to do with the internet as we know it today. They did so in the name of ensuring net neutrality, this wonderful, great, fuzzy thing, but the consequence of regulating the internet as net neutrality is the FCC was asserting the authority to regulate prices and terms of service on the internet, which is essentially everything and anything you offer on the internet. Now, if you want to kill the internet, it is difficult to come up with a more effective way to do it than putting Washington in charge of regulating prices and terms of service. I talked earlier about how the internet grew up as this oasis of freedom, how you could go and innovate, and you didn't need anyone's permission. If you had an idea, you went and put it up and ran with it, and you didn't have to imagine, okay, so let's run net neutrality forward a few years. The FCC has authority to regulate prices and terms of service. So someone comes up with a new means of providing service. Well, you have to go then to your Washington regulators to get permission. What plays out? When Washington takes over, who's benefited? The big guys are benefited. The people who have lobbyists are benefited. So let's take the Uber example. If Uber had to get prior permission from a regulator to offer to go into business, how many jurisdictions do you think would authorize it?
Well, they were kicking them out where they belong already.
The taxi guys are doing everything they can to lobby like crazy, saying, what do you mean we're having competition? But it's the difference between, you take the legal context, prior restraint versus activity after the fact. If the FCC has the authority to regulate on the front end, you don't ever get to launch Uber, which means you don't get a constituency for it. It's now harder to throw Uber out. Look, in Washington, D.C., I don't have a car. I've got a car at home in Texas, but I don't have a car here. A decade ago, that would have been unimaginable not to have a car. I work here during much of the week. But I either drive with members of our staff, or if I'm doing a personal thing, I jump in Uber. And it's very easy to whip out my phone and take Uber. And why would I pay for a car note and insurance and parking and all of that as compared to just jumping in an Uber? Once a new product, a new app, a new service gets in the market, you then get a constituency for keeping it because people like it. If you have government regulating on the front end, the app never appears to begin with. There's no constituency for it, and so it's only the people who face competition that are engaging in the lobbying. And I would say for all of those who are hysterical about the so-called end of net neutrality, the FCC had no authority to regulate the internet as a Title II utility before 2015. The last I checked, the internet worked pretty darn well up until 2015. And so this parade of horribles, I think, is largely constructed and driven by politicians in Washington who see something like the internet and want their grubby little hands on it because they want to regulate and tax everything they can. I think that would be terrible for freedom online.
So in the last minute or two that we have, what do you think about Mark Zuckerberg's testimony?
I think it was very troubling. There were a lot of issues that were brought up. There are a lot of issues that are concerning, but Zuckerberg and I had an exchange about online censorship yesterday. And I will say the power that is being accumulated in Silicon Valley of giant tech companies controlling the vast majority of communication, the vast majority of political discourse is staggering, and it's dangerous. And what's particularly dangerous, I mean, what I walked through with Zuckerberg yesterday was the pattern of Facebook, and for that matter, Twitter, and for that matter, Google, and a number of the other tech companies, that seem to be populated almost entirely by people on the hard political left, of using their power to, number one, silence voices they disagree, and number two, do it secretly and surreptitiously. So you think of William Randolph Hearst at the height of yellow journalism. I mean, we've seen biased journalists before. I mean, look, William Randolph Hearst got us in the Spanish-American War. I mean, journalists pushing an agenda can have real consequences in our public debate. But in that world, you could at least tell, okay, this paper has a point of view they're pushing. What I think is profoundly pernicious, you have now upwards of 2/3 of Americans getting their news from social media, and it's the ability to silently just make voices they disagree with disappear.
Well, with that, on that note, we're not disappearing, we're just ending the interview, and I want to thank you very, very much for being here today. Thank you to Charter for allowing us to talk about this very important issue of bridging the urban-rural broadband divide, and as always, really appreciate everything you do to help everybody move forward in this incredibly important area of the economy.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I will make a final closing observation, which is by any measure, Facebook and Google are larger than Standard Oil was when the antitrust laws broke it up. They're larger than AT&T were when the antitrust laws broke them up. And the power they wield is something we have not seen before, and so I think there is growing concern about how that power impacts our society, and I think we're going to continue to have debates about that.
Thank you.